the angel falls. One day there's no more room in heaven. The gates of heaven are closed. All the angels come down. Come down. It was just a children's song that my grandfather always sang. A warning to be good and to accept things as they are, rather than clinging unnecessarily to superficialities. A story where heaven closes and even the angels have to stay outside. I remember asking him once what that world would look like. He just stroked my hair, held me close, and sighed. "You'll see, my boy," he whispered. "I'm sorry, but one day you'll see." My grandfather's been gone for a long time now. His ashes were scattered in the lavender fields outside of Tombscock, Minnesota. A part of me still gets an uneasy feeling when I think of him, while another part hopes he made it through the gates. No, I'm not very religious, but a sentence can represent a concept, and a concept can be something powerful. Maybe there's no gate to heaven, but maybe there's a sense of peace we can experience in our final moments. That's all I can hope for, both for him and for myself. All my life, I've had that thought in the back of my mind. It didn't really influence me, but I could never forget it. Some time ago, it became relevant in a way I could never have imagined. At the time, I was working at a cafe. Nikki was my closest colleague. We shared every shift, and she was just a ray of sunshine wherever she went. She was half the reason we had so many regulars. She just brought joy, making every customer feel seen and cared for. She was kind, honest, and genuine. At the end of every shift, she wouldn't just wish me a good night, she'd wish me the best night. That's just how she was. Then she got sick with a brain aneurysm. Most people don't survive those, but Nikki did. So maybe it was just a small aneurysm. Either way, we all waited anxiously for an update, and eventually we got the news. Nikki was going to be fine, with little to no lasting damage. She would return to work once she recovered. There was a collective sense of relief among us and the regulars. Everything was going to be okay. Of course, it wasn't. When Nikki came back, she had visibly changed. That wasn't a huge surprise, considering what she had been through, but it was clear something drastic had happened. Just at first glance, she had lost about 10 kilos and had shaved her head at some point. Her hair was just starting to grow back. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her posture was hunched, and she walked as if she needed to lean on something. Still, it was Nikki, and we were all relieved to see her back behind the counter, even if her smile was a bit crooked. But there were many changes. At first, they were subtle. Sometimes she forgot a name or misspelled something. I thought it was just a leftover effect from the aneurysm, something that would go away with time since she was supposed to fully recover. But when I saw her eyes glaze over while talking to people, I started to wonder, was she really making mistakes, or did she just not care anymore? I remember one shift ending with her. As we closed up the cafe, I waved goodbye, expecting her to return the gesture as she always did. But she didn't. She didn't wish me the best night or even a good night. She just stood there in silence, her eyes 1,000 miles away. So I took the initiative. I went back into the cafe and approached her, clearing my throat. "Everything all right, Nikki?" I asked. "Yeah," she sighed. "I'm fine." "Great. You seem... What?" She turned to me, clearly uninterested in continuing the conversation, waiting for my answer. I shrugged. "Nothing," I smiled. "Have a good night." Yeah, and that was it. In the days that followed, I noticed more things were off with her. Not only did she forget regular customers, but she also started snapping at them. She mixed up their orders, and one time, she almost broke the microwave in the break room. She just stood there, watching the plate spin, while the spoon she'd left in the cup sparked inside. She knew it was wrong, but she just didn't care. I said nothing and didn't intervene until one day when I saw her shortchange an older man. He owed Nikki $6 and handed her a $50, but she only gave him $34 back, trying to pocket a tenner. She did it so smoothly, counting out $44, but leaving the 10 out when she handed him the change. At that point, I stepped in, trying to make it look like an honest mistake. The old man didn't seem to mind, as he'd always liked Nikki. But she turned to me and gave me a look I'd never seen on her before. A joyless smile behind dark, cold eyes. A look that said she'd do anything to ruin my day. "Thanks," she smiled. I would have felt awful if I hadn't. I don't know how I knew it, but I could see it. Behind that smile, there wasn't a shred of remorse. I tried to be empathetic because I'd heard that people's personalities can change after a serious trauma. That was to be expected. But Nikki hadn't just changed. It was like I was standing in front of a stranger. There was no trace of the enthusiasm that had made her so wonderful in the first place. What remained was a cold indifference, even contempt, for the things that used to make her special. It made me think, with all the things I had seen her do, what was she doing when no one was watching? How far would she go if she was willing to cheat that old man? And did I even want to know? During our next shift, I tested her. I'd pop back into the cafe at random times just to check on her when she thought I wasn't looking. She was on her phone, leaving the fridge open, forgetting to lock the back door. And the strangest thing was, she was smoking. I'd never seen her smoke before, but suddenly she was smoking in the break room. But the worst came at the end of the day when I saw her pocket money from the till. It was pure chance that I caught her. I had come back to grab a napkin and found her red-handed. We locked eyes across the room. Her face was like a brick wall, but I could see it trembling, cracking, revealing that joyless smile and those dark, blinking eyes. "You didn't see what you think you saw," she said. "I think I did," I replied. "No, you didn't see anything." Even her walk was different as she approached me. She came within arm's length, tossed an apron over her shoulder, and planted her hands on her hips. "Who do you think you're talking to?" she smiled. "You think you know me? You think you know this person?" "Nikki, you have to stop," I said. "This has to stop." "It doesn't have to stop," she laughed. "And do you know why?" She leaned in close and I could hear her grinding her teeth. Her voice was low and angry, as if she were holding back something terrible. "Because if I hear that you say anything to anyone..." Nikki stepped back, her cheerful facade slipping back into place. She held up 2 fingers in a playful little scissor motion. Snip, snip. What can I say? The next day I spoke to the manager. It wasn't planned, but I couldn't stay silent, so I told her about the threats, the money, the shortchanging, the smoking, everything. I tried to make it clear that I liked Nikki, but that she was hurting the business and herself. But my manager didn't seem too surprised, as apparently others had noticed too. She was going to speak to Nikki later that day anyway, and I had just thrown fuel on the fire. I felt terrible. But when I thought back to that little snip, snip gesture, no. I didn't want to think about what she might be capable of. There was no way of knowing anymore. Whatever had happened to Nikki, one thing was clear. I no longer knew who this person was. Shortly after, she was fired. I wasn't there, but my manager was visibly shaken afterward. She didn't want to talk about it, so I can only guess what was said behind closed doors. I thought that was the end of it, but it was only the beginning. The morning of my first shift without Nikki, I was the first to arrive. Right in front of the door, neatly laid out, was a pair of scissors, next to a handful of sunflowers with their heads snipped off. They had been tossed aside, and their bright yellow petals had turned a sickly blue in the dirt. I didn't even know that was possible, but I had no doubt this was a threat, and I felt a chill in my stomach. Just as I was about to open the door, a thought crossed my mind. I checked under the handle and found a razor blade taped to the back. If I had pressed down, I would have sliced my palm open. I removed the blade and reported it to my manager, but there was nothing we could do. The back security cameras had been down for months, something Nikki knew all too well. All day long, I couldn't stop wondering what she would do next. Maybe nothing. Or maybe something violent. A threat can be just a threat, but something inside me said I should take it seriously. This wasn't Nikki anymore. If she was willing to do something this crazy on day 1, what would she do on day 2? Of course, there were regulars who asked about her afterward. Most were concerned, and a few were heartbroken. But what surprised me the most were the ones who were relieved. "That's not her anymore," an older woman lamented. "It's like she never really came back." Those words stuck with me. It's like she never really came back. That's what it felt like. Sure, people can change, but people like Nikki? For the first time in years, I thought about my grandfather again. The gates of heaven close. All the angels come down, come down. In the days that followed, her warnings became more frequent and more blatant. A pair of scissors in front of my door, this time with 2 chestnuts. At lunch, we received a takeout order for 3 rolls with the note, Keep them. They'll be your last meal. With every nudge and bump, I was reminded that you never really knew what this woman was capable of. So it wasn't surprising when my manager called the police, and things escalated quickly from there. They couldn't find Nikki. Her apartment was trashed, her car was impounded after being found abandoned on the street, and her bathroom was covered in blood spatters. Apparently, her own, but she was nowhere to be found. We convinced the local sheriff to have a patrol car check on the cafe hourly, but for those of us who worked there, it still felt like the Wild West. That night, I was closing up the cafe by myself. The patrol car was supposed to show up, but it hadn't yet. As I was locking the door, I felt a shiver run down my spine. There, in the dim light of the alley behind the cafe, I could just make out a figure. I didn't need to get any closer to know who it was. Nikki. She was standing completely still, just watching me. My heart raced. I turned the key as quickly as I could, locked the door, and hurried to my car. I didn't look back. The next day, I found out from my manager that someone had broken into the cafe during the night. Nothing was stolen, but things were smashed. The register had been torn apart, and one of the tables was completely flipped over. The only thing that remained untouched was the pair of scissors on the counter, placed carefully next to a sunflower. That was the last straw. I went to the police and filed a report. They couldn't promise much, but they did agree to increase patrols in the area. For a few days, things were quiet. Nikki didn't show up, and there were no more messages. I thought maybe it was over. Maybe she had finally decided to leave me alone. But then, on my last shift before I was scheduled to take some time off, I found a note tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. It was written in Nikki's handwriting and it read, "You can't run forever." I don't know what happened to her after that. I haven't heard anything in months. Maybe she's moved on, maybe she hasn't. But I can't shake the feeling that one day she'll be back. And when that day comes, I'll be ready. There was no evidence that Nikki was behind it, even though everything pointed in her direction. Still, the threats were real and were treated as such. Mostly, 3 days went by without any incident. I started to calm down and considered the whole thing over. There was no word from Nikki, and everything indicated that she had left town. That evening, I came home from work, dropped my house keys into the bowl, wiped my shoes, and closed the door. I put away some groceries, drank a cola, and leaned against the kitchen table. It had been a long day, and I had prepared a chicken salad that was supposed to make everything better. That, and an episode of Love is Blind, Don't Judge Me. I stepped into the living room, ready to settle in for the night, when I noticed something. The curtains in my living room window had been shifted. Normally, I never open those curtains. After all, I lived on the first floor. I had just sat down when I turned my head towards the bedroom door. My phone was still on the kitchen table. I couldn't see anyone, but I held my breath nonetheless. I felt like prey, hoping desperately that I wouldn't be noticed if I stayed still enough. But no, Nikki had spotted me. The sound gave her away long before I saw her. That snipping of household scissors, followed by that joyless, deathly pale grin peeking around the corner, I grabbed the vase on the coffee table and stood up. At first glance, I couldn't even tell if it was really Nikki. She hadn't just cut her hair, but parts of her face too. There was a long gash running across her nose, almost reaching her eyebrows, along with a couple of slits in her ears and on her lip. She didn't seem to care, though. In fact, it made her smile even wider. "Did you get the message?" she grinned. And as if to clarify, she snipped the scissors twice and stepped closer. It all happened so quickly. She leapt over the couch, her rough, bloody feet pressing into the cushions, and lunged at me with full force, tearing down the curtains as she fell to the floor. Instinctively, I threw the vase at her and reached for my phone. But I had no chance to call for help. She was on me. Instead, I grabbed the first thing within reach, my salad knife, and struck her in the neck. Nikki recoiled, pulling the knife out. Blood splattered across the white and sky blue tiles of the kitchen. Her smile only grew wider as her eyes fixed on mine. "You still don't know who you're talking to," she rasped, her voice turning into a ghastly wheeze as air escaped the hole in her throat. She staggered towards me, her body struggling to stay upright, pointing the scissors at me. "You don't know." And with that, she collapsed. I grabbed my phone, stepped over her, and dialed emergency services. Just as I was about to press the call button, an immense pain shot through my shoulder. Every nerve in my right side felt like it was on fire. As my fingers cramped, I dropped the phone, turned around, and saw what had happened. A slight tug came from my shoulder. Something was stuck there. Nikki was back on her feet as if nothing had happened, and blood was still pouring from her neck. "I'm Kevin," she said cheerfully, crossing her arms behind her back. "What?" That was all I could manage before she attacked me again. The scissors that had been lodged in my shoulder fell to the ground, and I dodged her lunge, grabbing them as I spun and pressed myself against the wall for momentum. I lunged at her head-on and drove the scissors into her left eye. For a second, she froze, her breath catching. I could hear my own heartbeat and felt the pulse race through my hands. As the moment passed, she blinked. Her right eye blinked freely, but the left one pressed against the steel of the scissors. I shoved her away. She should have been dead. The scissors were buried deep. "Now I'm Emmett," she said. "You should be more careful." A completely different accent and stance. She stood up straight, finally fully upright, and wiped the blood from her cheek. Though it didn't help, she was still bleeding profusely, which seemed to annoy her. Then she pulled the scissors out and gave me a confused look with her uninjured eye. "Let's kill each other," she said. Again, she came at me, and this time, I injured her with the shards of my broken vase, after which she called herself Morgan. I died. With the shards of a fallen picture frame, I hit her, and suddenly, she was Lillian. I don't know how many times she attacked me, but my arms were covered in cuts, and she even managed to slash me across the face, just missing my ear. I kept stabbing her with whatever I could find, into her eyes, her throat, her heart, and her lungs. Her stomach looked like a knife block, and yet she kept coming at me. Google it, you'll love me. Nikki literally seemed to grow, her arms stretching, her legs bending at unnatural angles, snapping as her bones twisted. Then she ripped the cord from a nearby lamp and bit down on it, unconcerned that it cost her 3 teeth. She wrapped the cord around her hands, ready to strangle someone with it. Another tooth slipped from her mouth as I backed into the bedroom, stumbling over an old wooden chair next to the bed, breaking it as I fell. I ended up on my back, looking up at Nikki, who lunged at me with childlike enthusiasm, her blood-soaked tongue hanging out with glee. I managed to get under the bed, but she wrapped the cord around my foot and dragged me out, kicking and screaming. She applied so much pressure to my ankle that I thought it would tear off. The neighbors must have called the police because I heard sirens. When Nikki turned her head, I grabbed a chair leg, pulled myself up, and struck her hard across the jaw, knocking her down. I took advantage of the situation, climbed on top of her, and struck her over and over again with the chair leg. "I'm murder," she said. "I'm daddy. I'm killer. I'm... I couldn't stop hitting her, and she wouldn't stop talking. She kept coming back, even after the muscles and structure of her face had been turned to pulp. She persisted, long after her words had turned into nothing but sounds. The pole slipped from my hand. She barely twitched anymore, emitting only a ghastly gurgling sound. I hadn't even realized I'd been screaming, and maybe I'd been screaming the whole time. It was as if my soul pulled back into my body, putting my actions into perspective. I had beaten her to death, but death simply wouldn't come. As I wept, I heard the sirens getting closer. 2 of her fingers softly brushed against my left palm. With immense effort, she turned her blind face towards me. "There's nothing," she gurgled. "There's nothing." And as those empty eyes stared into mine, she uttered her final words, "Come down." The police broke down the door and pulled me away from Nikki. I hardly remember where they took me. I was so out of it that all I can recall is the light, a dark hallway, a bright ambulance, a flashlight in my eyes, distant voices introducing themselves. "I'm a nurse, this, I'm a doctor, that, officer, sheriff." They all asked me 1,000 questions at once, but only one stuck out. "Do you understand this?" And no, I didn't. They chalked it up to a psychotic episode of self-defense, triggered by harassment and mania. There was an investigation, assessments, sessions, everything. I remember a doctor somewhere in there. Time flew by, and I think I couldn't think clearly for over a month after the attack. It was as if something deep and unsettling had been stirred inside me. But with time, well, what else can you do but live? And that's exactly what I did. Now, people in town know me as the guy who survived a break-in by some kind of stalker woman. I don't mind, and I don't even want to think about what they call me. What am I anyway? What was she? I need to stop calling her Nikki because Nikki had been gone for a long time. Maybe she never came back. The scars are still there, but they don't bother me nearly as much as her final words. As that eyeless face turned towards me, she chose words I know only one person would choose. Come down. And yes,